The countdown had already started when I realized nobody was going to stop it. My name is Vex Thara, and I was standing on the observation platform of Ashkalith Station when the galaxy watched a human being sentenced to death. I was not a soldier. I was not a judge. I was a junior attaché for the Concord Assembly, a small clerk in a very large machine, and I told myself that made me innocent. I know now that it did not. Her name was Elena Voss. She was the human ambassador to the Concord, and she stood on a platform surrounded by a dozen alien species who had already decided her fate before the trial even started. I remember the noise. Thousands of voices from 1,000 worlds, all cheering, all relieved that the loud, stubborn, unpredictable humans were finally going to learn their place. I cheered too. I am ashamed to say that now, but I did. Everyone did. Elena did not look afraid. She looked at the crowd, and then she looked directly into the camera that was broadcasting her execution to every corner of Concord space. And she said something that I did not understand until it was far too late. She said, "You did not execute a diplomat today. You just told my people that the talking is over." Then the chamber sealed, and 30 seconds later, Ambassador Elena Voss was gone. The Concord celebrated for 3 days. Fireworks lit up the sky above a dozen capital worlds. Leaders gave speeches about how humanity had finally been humbled, how their arrogance had finally met its match. I stood in the crowd on Ashkalith Station and clapped along with everyone else, because that is what you do when the whole galaxy agrees on something. You do not ask questions, you just go along. On the 4th day, Earth's fleet went dark. At first nobody noticed, because nobody was really watching. Human ships had always patrolled the border in a lazy, almost sloppy pattern, broadcasting routine chatter, running drills that half the Concord military found embarrassing to watch. Humans talked too much on open channels. They joked with each other. They sang songs during long shifts. It was one of the things we mocked them for. Then the chatter stopped. I was working in the communications office on Ashkalith Station when the silence became impossible to ignore. A colleague of mine, a thin, nervous being named Corlin, tapped my shoulder and pointed at a screen full of empty frequencies. He said, "Listen to this." I said, "I do not hear anything." He said, "Exactly." For years, the human border frequencies had never gone quiet, not even for a minute. Even during minor conflicts, there was always something. A supply request, a joke between pilots, a complaint about food rations. Now there was nothing. Not static, not silence with noise underneath it. Just a clean, total absence, like someone had reached out and turned off a switch that connects an entire species to the rest of the universe. The Concord Assembly convened an emergency session within hours. I was not important enough to be in the room, but I was important enough to stand outside the door and listen to what leaked out. The mood inside was not fear. It was confusion, mixed with a strange kind of pride. Many of the delegates believed humanity was simply retreating, pulling back its ships in shame after losing their ambassador. Some even suggested humans were preparing a small, symbolic strike, something that could be absorbed and forgiven, the kind of gesture that lets a defeated people save face. I remember one delegate, an older being named Asen who had negotiated with humans for over a decade, standing up and saying something that nobody wanted to hear. He said, "You do not understand them. When humans go quiet, it is not because they are afraid. It is because they have already decided what they are going to do, and they no longer feel the need to explain it to you." Nobody listened to him. The meeting ended with a vote to increase border patrols and monitor the situation. Nobody suggested reaching out to apologize. Nobody suggested that maybe, just maybe, we had made an enormous and permanent mistake. I could not sleep that night. I kept replaying Elena's last words in my mind. "You just told my people the talking is over." At the time I had thought it was just something dramatic people say before they die, a final performance for the cameras. Now it sounded like a warning that had been ignored by everyone who heard it, including me. 2 weeks passed, and the silence did not break. Sensor stations along the border reported nothing. No fleet movements, no supply convoys, no colony broadcasts. It was as if humanity had simply vanished behind an invisible wall, and nobody could tell what was happening on the other side. I was eventually assigned to a small fact-finding envoy, 6 of us in total, sent to approach human space and gather information. I still do not know why they chose me. Perhaps because I was young enough to be expendable and low-ranking enough that my disappearance would not cause a diplomatic incident. Perhaps because somebody in the assembly still had a small, uncomfortable feeling of guilt and wanted a witness who could report back honestly. Our ship was called the Wanderline, a modest transport with outdated shielding, and a crew that had clearly never expected to be sent anywhere near an actual crisis. Our captain was a calm, steady woman named Priya Okonkwo, not human herself but someone who had spent years working alongside them, and understood their culture better than most. She did not celebrate the execution. I remember that clearly, because she was one of the very few people I knew who refused to attend the viewing party our station had organized. She told me once, quietly, in the days before we launched, that she had a bad feeling about all of this. She said humans are strange in a way most species do not appreciate. They forgive small things easily. They forget slights quickly. But there is a line, and once you cross it, they do not get angry in the way you expect. They get quiet, and quiet humans are the ones you should be afraid of. I did not understand what she meant until we crossed into the outer edge of human space. The first thing we found was not a fleet. It was a beacon, floating alone in an empty stretch of space that used to be a busy trade route. It was old technology, simple, almost primitive compared to what humans usually built. It was broadcasting the same message on a loop, repeated in every language known to the Concorde. The message said, "Ambassador Voss's status has been noted. Diplomatic relations are suspended pending review. All Concorde vessels are advised to withdraw from human territory until further notice." That was it. No threats, no declarations, no demands, just a calm, almost bureaucratic notice, the kind of message you might expect from an office closing early for a holiday, not from a species that had just lost its representative to an execution. Priya read the message 3 times before she spoke. She said, "This is worse than a threat." I asked her why. She said, "Because a threat means they still want something from us. A threat means there is room to negotiate. This is not a threat. This is a door closing." We continued deeper, cautious, our sensors sweeping every direction for any sign of activity. We found human colonies, but they were sealed. Defense grids that used to be open for trade and travel were now completely shut, layered with additional shielding that had clearly been built in a hurry. Ships that once greeted visitors with music and lighthearted chatter now gave no response at all. It was like flying through a graveyard that refused to admit it was one, because everything still looked intact. Nothing was destroyed, nothing was burning. It was simply closed, locked, and silent. We reached a listening post near the edge of what used to be an open human trade hub. There, we managed to intercept a fragment of encrypted communication, something our translators struggled to fully decode, but enough came through to send a chill through every member of our crew. The fragment mentioned something called the Compact. It suggested that Ambassador Voss had not just been a diplomat representing Earth's interests. She had been the guarantor of an agreement, something that kept the full weight of humanity's military restrained and hidden, visible only through the ambassador's presence and public reassurances. As long as she stood in front of the Concorde and vouched that diplomacy still worked, humanity held itself back. Her execution had not just ended a life. It had ended the only condition under which humanity's restraint made sense. I asked Priya what that meant, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely frightened. She said, "It means nobody is holding them back anymore. Not a council, not a treaty, nothing. Whatever happens now is not a decision made by leaders sitting around a table. It is simply what is allowed to happen, quietly, without witnesses, without oversight." We tried to make contact one more time before withdrawing, broadcasting a formal request for dialogue on every frequency we could find. For hours, there was no response. Then, just as we were preparing to leave, a single message came through, calm and precise, spoken by a voice that identified itself only as a coordination officer. The voice said, "The Concorde Assembly has been informed of the terms required to reopen diplomatic contact. Compliance has not yet been received. This channel will now close." And it did, just like that. We returned to Ashkalith Station with our findings, and I expected panic. I expected the Assembly to finally take this seriously. Instead, I found something almost worse, a kind of stubborn denial. Delegates argued that humanity was bluffing, that a species so young and so outnumbered could not possibly maintain a silence this disciplined for long. Some suggested probing further into human space to test their resolve. Others suggested waiting them out, convinced that Earth would eventually crack under the pressure of isolation. I stood in a side room during one of these debates, and I finally understood something that had been building inside me since the day of the execution. We had spent years mocking humanity for being loud, emotional, unpredictable. We had built an entire narrative around their weaknesses, their impatience, their tendency to argue among themselves in public. We used that narrative to justify everything, including the execution of a woman who had spent her entire career trying to keep the peace. What we never understood, what none of us ever bothered to understand, was that the loudness was a choice. It was not weakness, it was restraint disguised as noise, a way of keeping tension low, of keeping things familiar and manageable. Elena Voss had spent years standing between 2 very different possibilities for how first contact with humanity could unfold. and she had chosen the version where everyone kept talking, kept laughing, kept pretending the danger was smaller than it actually was. We killed that version the moment we executed her. Weeks turned into months. Ashkalith Station's council received sporadic reports from other Concord worlds along the border. Some described strange, brief appearances of unmarked vessels near their systems, ships that would appear for a few moments, scan the area thoroughly, and then vanish without any communication at all. Nothing hostile happened during these encounters, but the message was unmistakable. Someone was watching, someone was cataloging, someone was patient. I began to understand why Priya had been so afraid. A species that shouts and threatens gives you time to prepare, time to guess their next move. A species that goes silent and simply watches gives you nothing. You do not know when the waiting ends, or what happens after it does. During this time, I tried to learn more about Elena Voss herself, hoping to understand what kind of person she had been before she became a symbol we destroyed so carelessly. I found recordings of her early speeches, long before she became ambassador, when she was still a young researcher working on cultural exchange programs between Earth and the Concord. In one recording, she spoke about her hope that humanity and the wider galaxy could build something lasting together, something based on patience rather than fear. She said, "We are not asking to be feared. We are asking to be understood. But if understanding fails, remember that patience has a limit, even for us." I watched that recording more times than I would like to admit. Every time, I felt the same cold weight settle in my chest. We had been given a warning years before the execution, delivered gently, wrapped in hope rather than threat, and we had ignored it completely, because it was easier to laugh at humanity's confidence than to consider that it might be justified. 8 months after the execution, the silence finally broke, but not in the way anyone expected. There was no invasion, no sudden attack, no fleet appearing at the edge of Concord space with weapons blazing. Instead, a single message was broadcast simultaneously to every major Concord world, translated into every known language, delivered in a calm, steady voice that I later learned belonged to a young officer named Daniel Ashford, newly appointed as Earth's temporary representative. He said, "This is a message from the government of Earth to the Concord Assembly. We are aware of the events surrounding the death of Ambassador Elena Voss. We are aware of the celebrations that followed. We have chosen, for now, not to respond with force, because Ambassador Voss believed until her final moment that peace was still possible, and we intend to honor that belief for as long as we are able." He continued, however, "This silence has not been rest. It has been reorganization. Every decision our species makes from this point forward will be made with the understanding that diplomacy failed once, publicly, without consequence, and that failure will not be forgotten. We are choosing patience today. We cannot promise patience tomorrow." The message ended there, without further explanation, without demands, without any indication of what might come next. It was somehow more unsettling than any threat could have been, because it left the entire galaxy waiting, unsure whether the door had been left open or simply left unlocked for now. The Concord Assembly scrambled to respond, issuing formal apologies, promising investigations into the circumstances of Elena's trial, offering reparations and new treaties. I do not know if any of it will matter. I do not know if trust, once broken this completely, can ever be rebuilt through official statements and careful diplomatic language. I think about Elena often now. I think about the way she looked into that camera in her final moments, calm and certain, as if she already knew exactly how this would unfold. I think about how easy it was for all of us to cheer, to feel powerful for a few days, without ever considering what we were truly giving up. Priya once told me something I have never forgotten. She said that every species eventually reveals what it values most, not through its words, but through its silence. The Concord's silence after the execution was denial. Humanity's silence was discipline. And somewhere between those two silences, an entire future was quietly decided without any of us fully realizing it was happening. I am recording this account now from Ashkalith Station, uncertain whether it will ever reach anyone beyond this room. The outer sensors flickered a few minutes ago, the same strange flicker that preceded the fleet's silence all those months ago. I do not know what that means. Perhaps it means nothing. Perhaps it is simply old equipment failing after years of neglect. Or perhaps it means the waiting is coming to an end, and something new is about to begin. I used to believe that being part of the Concord Assembly made me a witness to history, rather than a participant in it. I understand now how wrong that belief was. Every cheer in that crowd, every clap, every moment of silence when someone tried to raise a concern, all of it added up to a decision, even if none of us meant to make one. We asked, without ever saying it out loud, what humanity would do if the talking truly stopped. I think, very soon, we are finally going to find out. I only wish, more than anything else I have ever wished for, that I had not been one of the ones cheering.